Okay, welcome to this event, which is sponsored by the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University. I'm Audrey Kurth Cronin, founding director of the center and distinguished professor of international security at American University in Washington, D.C. Our guest today is Dr. Tim Wilson, the director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, or CSTPV. That's a post that he assumed in 2016. It's located in the beautiful St. Andrews, Scotland, at St. Andrews University. It's the oldest research center devoted to the academic study of terrorism and a very famous center. It's well known for its distinguished faculty, graduates, and honorary scholars, including Richard English, Bruce Hoffman, Louise Richardson, Adam Roberts, and Hugh Strawn, who are all honorary fellows. In addition to being the director of the center, Dr. Wilson has a distinguished academic career focusing on the past, present, and future of terrorism and political violence. His first book, Frontiers of Violence, was nominated for the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize in 2010. The topic of our conversation today is Dr. Wilson's second book, Killing Strangers: How Political Violence Became Modern, which was published late last year, 2020. Reviewers have described it as original, lucid, elegant, and rich, and I certainly agree. It's a wonderful book. I urge you to read it. And here is the actual book cover. I'm looking forward to hearing about it and talking about it with Dr. Wilson in the next 30 or 40 minutes. And then we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience, which should be posted in the Q&A function, please. And I'll try to get to as many of them as I can before our seminar ends at 11:30. So again, welcome, Dr. Tim Wilson and all of the audience members, and I'll turn it over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Audrey, for that extremely warm welcome. Thank you too for holding up the cover of Killing Strangers. My 10-year-old daughter did come up with a rival design, but Oxford University Press didn't, unfortunately, run with it. It's a huge honor to speak to the Center for Security, Innovation and New Technology. I must confess to a certain trepidation when I looked over your areas of focus. I noticed that there was the future of war, the future of nuclear weapons, changing technology, and the future of work. If there is ever a word to make a historian run for the hills, it's the word future. Historians always come back saying, future, that's not my period. But it was reassuring to see there was also a tab on the history of technology. And of course, that is an area in which you have written with such distinction yourself. And if I may be forgiven for a moment's vanity, because of course authors never spend their time neurotically checking what their book looks like on Amazon. But it is a great honor that when you look on Power to the People on Amazon, it says frequently bought together with Killing Strangers. So to follow in that algorithmic slipstream is indeed a big honor. I'm going to say a little bit, if I may, about how I came to write Killing Strangers and what I was trying to do within it. It is a sort of truism or a cliche, I suppose, that all books at one level are autobiography. And the origin of Killing Strangers really came out of my teaching at the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, are inelegantly named, but as Professor Cronin has said, rather now venerable center up in St. Andrews. And I should explain that, I'm really a historian who's somehow blundered into terrorism studies. And a question that I came up with for our students at St. Andrews a few years back, I thought had a certain elegant cadence to it. I asked them in their first semester this essay question, what, if anything, is modern about terrorism? And, in fairness to St. Andrews students, they could cope with the thorny thicket of how to define terrorism. After all, one of my very distinguished predecessors is Professor Alex Schmidt as director at CSTPV. And he is, of course, the man who spent over 40 years of his life on what I think of as a kind of, a bit like Captain Ahab chasing the whale in Moby Dick. He sailed the high seas of knowledge, trying to spear that definitive definition of terrorism indefatigably. So, there are no worse places to start than Alex Schmidt's work on the definition of terrorism. They could cope with the idea of nailing down terrorism. But I have to say, friends, that this was not a career highlight for me. That essay question, what, if anything, is modern about terrorism, turned out, I think it's fair to say, to be something of a turkey. I'm not sure I ever really got a very satisfactory answer to it. And of course, the problem was the concept of modernity. The students tended to take it, and this is an indictment of my own teaching, of course, but they tended to take it as a synonym for recent. They were thinking of 20 years at most. I was thinking of 200 years or so. So really, in a sense, Killing Strangers is my therapy. It's an attempt to answer my own exam question as to what, if anything, is modern about terrorism. And again, Professor Cronin, you've been very kind to email also not to email, but to tweet about it being a new history of terrorism. I mean, it's fair to say it is, of course. To some extent, it's a kind of history of terrorism that dare not speak the name. I'm actually quite careful not really to use the word terrorism, although I do talk about terroristic violence in a kind of Alex Schmittian sense of a type of violence that targets one group to send a signal to another group or government. But it's, that really was a definite choice. And I think if there is a methodological innovation to Killing Strangers, it's really in that I didn't set out to define terrorism precisely and then reverse engineer a kind of genealogy to suit. Instead, I set out with a much looser or impressionistic sense of what might be called political violence and tried to look at how it actually had changed over time, particularly within whatever one might call the global north, North America, Europe, over the last 250 years since the revolutions in America and France. So a very conventional arena and time frame, really, but trying to sort of identify, was there, in a sense, something that shifted here? Was there a sort of evolution? We sometimes talk about a Western way of war. Was there a Western way of political violence that became distinctive and then was effectively exported around the world? And I'm deeply indebted to Power to the People, because it's done the hard graft of mapping dynamite attacks that I have not done. But I can recommend the map on page 86, which does show that between the sort of 1860s and about 1934, I think, or so, these dynamite attacks are heavily concentrated near where the dynamite factories are, which is overwhelmingly, though not totally, in the area I've just described of sort of Western Europe and North America predominantly. So there is a sort of an agenda there, as I say, to say, is there something distinctive about this violence? And perhaps particularly in a particularly heterodox fashion, does it tell us something about the societies from which it came? Like so many others, I'm driven back to Martha Crenshaw's wonderful 1981 article on the causes of terrorism, in which she writes, quote, to develop a framework for the analysis of likely settings of terrorism, we must establish conceptual distinctions. She goes on to talk about the difference between preconditions and precipitants. And basically, an awful lot of work in terrorism studies is about precipitants. It's about sort of effectively direct triggers. I was interested in what I think of as a kind of low-grade research, or the preconditions, the backgrounds, really from the conviction that violence to some extent never stands apart entirely from the society in which it occurs. We often, I think of the types of violence we call terrorism as somehow intrusive, somehow disruptive, and particularly, I think, if I may be so bold, I think particularly in the North American context, and particularly in the wake of 9/11, as essentially predominantly a foreign policy issue, which is not entirely different. That there's no accident CSTPV is in a Department of International Relations. I was kind of more interested in saying, could it tell us something about the societies in which it occurs and in which it first arose? So the concept of modernity in which I work is really rather broad angled, but one might say it's kind of really trying to chart the transition from a world that was used to be predominantly tradition-bound, agrarian, rural, characterized by subsistence economies, to one that is industrial, urban, networked, mobile, and characterized by fast evolving technologies. And that isn't, so modernity is kind of seen as not as an end state or a terminus, certainly not as just becoming Western. I think if we've learned anything, it's that modernity isn't just Western, but it is certain that these processes did occur arguably in the areas that we call the West, I guess. And really, I suppose the starting claim here is that something big shifted that created a type of political violence, which we do often call terrorism, I guess, which is historically strange. Killing strangers is strange killing, I suppose, is the kind of soundbite summary. What do I mean by that? I mean simply that we all live now in a contemporary world in which one cannot catch an aeroplane, one cannot travel on a metro or a subway system anywhere really in the world, and not be reminded by the safety announcements that total strangers might slaughter us at any moment without any warning at all. And that, again, to reference Alex Schmidt, really, there's something strange about this. I think that, we at one level become used to this, but, perhaps we should find it more strange than we often do. He wrote back in 1988 in his, seminal work on political terrorism with Youngman, what was strange about terrorism, which was that it was a puzzle. Terrorists destroy innocent people to create a better world. And then to quote from him directly, the destruction that terrorists bring about is real. The better world they strive for is an uncertain gamble with history. Perhaps a theory of terrorism must also be a theory of the absurd, which would go some way towards explaining why we have been so unsuccessful in theory building so far. So this kind of quality of impersonal violence, of what the writer Joseph Conrad called bloodstained inanity, or what the English common law calls universal malice, is really what I wanted to explore. I was interested in where it had come from historically and what might have been the forces that created it. So it's really a book informed by a very simple question: how did we get here? Because here is a strange place seen in a longer term historical perspective. And just to sort of try and sharpen up that point, really, I was struck by, if one does go a long way back and start reading about how did what one might think of as political or proto-political violence work a good way back, it often looks pretty simple, pretty strange to us. So a sort of anecdote that I liked, and I know that hanging entire meta theory on an anecdote may be overambitious, but it did seem to resonate with me. The anecdote I liked came from 1790s, from the revolutionary turmoil in southern France, where a local official was trying to write to his superiors in the regional capital at Nîmes to say that his men had had nothing to do with a series of local murders. And the reason he gave was this: he said simply, quote, "You can grasp that we could not be the enemies of people that we don't know." And that was, in that one phrase, "you can grasp that we can't be the enemies of people we don't know," essentially is a kind of, micro theory of how violence in that time and place works. You had to know people, you had to be in a kind of toxic, intimate relationship with them to think that you'd want to kill them. And that seems, as I say, very different from the world we all know. So where have these types of impersonal atrocity come from? How have we ended up in this strange place? Well, I mean, to summarize, in some ways, a rather kind of diverse and sprawling book, I think. You should never criticize your own book, let the critics do that for you. But, it is an ambitious book. In a sense, it's structured around, a rather simple kind of push-pull dichotomy. I look, first of all, at push factors. What were the forces that compressed or forced political violence, rebel violence, if you like, into certain forms, not others? And really, I make an argument for the rise of what I call the society of hyper-order, of the rise of state power in the Western states I look at. This takes different iterations. There is definitely a cleavage down the Atlantic, or between the old world and the new, and between Canada and the USA to some extent. The USA has much more of a tradition of tolerating violence in certain parts of society, because it's not seen as, or hasn't been, at least until recently, I'll let you question me on that, genuinely system threatening, as Richard Hofstadter said in his classic essay on Reflections on American Violence 50 years ago. The European model, the sort of essentially Napoleonic model, I suppose, is in some ways a simpler one. It's about the sort of cumulative power of bureaucracies of coercion to squeeze out violence from daily life, from public life, relentlessly. And this is really just trying to build on a very old insight of Max Weber, that bureaucracy and coercion belong together. And when my students look blank at that, I say, well, I suggest that you try an experiment. Go to the library, take out a book, don't check it back, never return it, see what happens. Eventually you'll get polite emails to remind you, you'll get less polite emails to remind you. If you carry on trying to use the library, the staff will challenge you. If you still carry on, eventually security will be called, and then eventually law enforcement or whatever. Behind bureaucracy always lies coercion. That's why we find our tax demands or whatever it is stressful. I mean, obviously, this is a thought experiment. I'm sure the library staff at American University are delightful and they don't need that extra hassle. But the point is, I think, a fundamental one. And, really, the point I was trying to make is that, compared to, say, even the most powerful societies of the ancient or medieval worlds, the degree of surveillance and control that governments potentially have over their citizens is extraordinary. The Roman Empire had no police force. There's a reason why houses in Pompeii look like fortresses, and so on and so forth. But if one takes even somewhere like Montana in the late 20th century, the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, holed up in his cabin with no running water and no electricity, he still couldn't dodge the census taker. Someone was noting who he was and where he was. So to this extent, the argument I'm making is that the kind of violence we call terrorism, or this kind of challenge to the state, ends up getting relentlessly squeezed into certain hit and run forms, and often only kind of thrives really in the gaps between bureaucracies, particularly in federal states or regionalized states. One of my favorite examples is the communist group in Belgium, there's only about 4 of them, and they staged over 25 bombings, but they were being chased by about, 300 different law enforcement agencies, none of whom talk to each other. More tragically and dramatically, if one reads the 9/11 report, of course, the fault line between the FBI and the CIA runs right down the middle of it, like the San Andreas Fault. So to that extent, I'm not arguing bureaucracies are all powerful, but they certainly structure and compress and coerce violence into certain forms, not others. And much of the first half of the book is actually charting the decline of the types of violence that don't seem to happen anymore. The military style coups. When was there last a sort of successful revolution in the Western world? I mean, you'd have to go a very long way back, certainly to find one that wasn't sparked off by a defeat in an international war. 1848, perhaps. I mean, when was there last a revolutionary situation, to use that, what I think of as a kind of Marxist comfort blanket term for a situation that didn't turn into a revolution, but maybe could have done? Well, arguably May 1968 in Paris, and that's even, I'm getting on a bit, and that's even before my birth. So, certain types of challenge to the state just seem to kind of wither, and what we're left with in many ways is a kind of hit and run forms of terrorism, the wars of the 6 against the 60 million, to use Heinrich Böll's famous phrase about the Red Army faction in West Germany in the 1970s. So that is a large part of the argument, is a kind of attempt, really, a kind of historical sociology of the state, which I think often isn't there in discussions of terrorism and counterterrorism, and an attempt to sort of really locate counter-terrorist agencies against a wider and broader phenomenon of coercive state control, which is always there in the background. As I say, I mean, as an aside, one of the kind of fascinating things about writing Killing Strangers was what I learned about American history, because I've long struggled with the idea that a country that really, as late as 1934 or whatever, didn't really have a national police force, until you have the sort of Bonnie and Clyde car gangster era. But 10 years later is staging D-Day and conquering half the Pacific. And I'm sure from an American perspective, that's entirely natural. But from a European perspective, that's an interesting state that it can be so powerful and yet also so decentralized. But when it needs to shut down Al Capone for his tax evasion or whatever, there is the capacity to do so. Then the other half of the argument is the pull factors. What have been the developments that have incentivized or encouraged political violence to take some forms, not others? And I imagine this might be of perhaps particular interest to a centre that puts technology first. And really, here I would try, I suppose, to do something similar to the wonderful account in Power to the People of looking at technology as culturally embedded, as belonging to its time and its place, but also as changing its time and its place. My CSTPV colleague, Gilbert Ramsey, once wrote, quote, "We forget that technology doesn't just help us get more of what we want, it changes what we want and how we understand our very existence." And there's a lot I could say on that. Hopefully we'll have time in the discussion perhaps to do so. But I think, here I would just sort of offer a couple of thoughts up, that there's something, I think, about the changing speed and density of communication that incentivizes certain types of violent communication and signaling rather than others. And just to give you a snapshot, in 1789, when the Bastille fell, it took 10 days for the news to reach Norfolk in eastern England. In 1963, when the JFK was shot, 99.8% of Americans had heard within 5.5 hours. And of course, just a couple of years back, 2019, we reached the awful milestone of a live streamed massacre on Facebook in Christchurch, New Zealand. So this kind of accelerating pace of communication, I think, does something to political violence. It's kind of, if you like, a sort of Doppler effect, in that same way as a siren doesn't just get louder as it gets closer, it actually changes its tone. So there is a sense in which certain types of signaling acquire potency and become attractive to certain actors in a way they just would not have done before. They wouldn't have made sense. So to that extent, I try and kind of put terroristic violence really at the extreme end of a much broader spectrum, in which all power in the modern world depends to some extent on the ability to pull the tides of mass attention one's way. That's celebrity, that's activism of all kinds of sorts, that's kind of conventional politics. It's how commercial advertising also works. So to that extent, I think we can perhaps usefully understand much of the kind of contemporary terrorism we see as against that wider backdrop and against those wider processes that have developed over the last 150 plus years. I think there are also some angles to this that remain strikingly underexplored. I mean, it is a commonplace claim, rightly so, in the slowly burgeoning history of terrorism literature that, clearly dynamite is a key turning point. And, just for its sheer energy density, it clearly is, as Power to the People wonderfully documents, a major break point. But it seemed to me striking that, why has a tactical form of bombing remained so predominant for so long, when it, emerges really in the, good while back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, whatever. So, the Tweed database of attacks in Europe from 1950 to 1995, says that, no less than 55.1% of terrorist attacks in that database are bombings. If one thinks sort of anecdotally or impressionistically of the number of lone actor or small cell attacks in recent years, Anders Breivik or the Barcelona cell, where they ended up doing something else, but they put a hell of a lot of effort into building bombs as well, even though it was, arguably either unsuccessful or not too rewarding. What is it about bombing that makes it so attractive? And I try and explore in a rather long and discursive passage the kind of social psychology of bombing. One, its evasive quality, the fact that it avoids confrontation. This is kind of borrowed from the work of Randall Collins, that a lot of violence up close and personal is very stressful for human beings, whereas, as he provocatively puts it, a lot of terroristic violence and bombings in particular are the sort of the weapon of the meek, with an M, not a W. Which I think is a profound insight. But I think there are also, satisfactions of sort of superiority and smugness. It's amazing how often in ballads and jargon and jokes, bombs are referred to in sort of terms of being a practical joke. The phrase "booby trap," is clearly not accidental. And that seemed to me suggestive. So as I say, I've tried to sort of place these technological developments, and I must confess, talking to this sophisticated audience, I mean, I'm a man who can barely wire a plug, and I've certainly, when Roger Davies, with his wonderful blog "Standing Well Back," as the ex-head of the British Army bomb squad in Northern Ireland, he would put me right that I shouldn't talk about miniaturization of explosives. I should talk about energy density and other technical terms. But in a sense, I can't talk with authority on the technology, but the extent to which it's embedded in these wider cultural, social, economic processes, I do think is worth exploring. I think I'd just complement that by saying, I think power of communication also helps us think about some of the mysteries of terrorist tactics that I don't think are sufficiently well recognized, particularly the phenomenon of what I think of as tactical warehousing. In other words, tactics are available, they're possible, they may even have been tried, and yet they sit on the shelf sometimes for decades before they occur in a sort of repetitive way. There's sort of momentum to attacks builds, and there's kind of imitative pattern that I think is traceable to the rise of a mass communication society. The obvious answer to me is the relationship that I talk about at some length between the motor vehicle and political violence. The first drive-by shooting that I've come across, I'm happy to be corrected, but the first drive-by shooting I've come across is a race riot in St. Louis in 1917. The car bomb starts to emerge really, there are horse-drawn wagon bombs as well, but it really starts to emerge in the 30s, or particularly in Palestine, actually, in the mid-40s. So, drive-by shootings, drive-by bombings, car bombs, these are, well attested and established tactics. And yet, really, the use of motor vehicles, automobiles, cars, trucks, as a weapon in their own right for ramming, has only really taken off in the last decade, or perhaps slightly longer. That's very strange to me. If these vehicles, certainly the USA has been a mass ownership society for motor vehicles for 100 years. How do we explain that delayed diffusion? And I think we do need to sort of factor in there mimetic effects of burgeoning communication density and speed, particularly in the social media age. Which brings me really onto the last point, thinking of the sort of 6th of January riots, as to a theme throughout the book really is borrowing a phrase from the British Prime Minister William Gladstone in 1881, talking about Irish political violence. We said that the resources of civilization have not been tested yet. What are the resources of civilization in 2021? How stable are our societies to threats from below? I think, as I've said, many of the conventional threats have died away, and yet there is something about the rise of social media that is profoundly destabilizing, if often in inchoate and unpredictable ways. But how genuinely system threatening that is, to some extent, I am agnostic, and that's just to be honest and open about my own indecision there. In some ways, killing strangers is an audit of my own confusions, and I use audit in the British sense of a kind of an inventory, not in the American sense of sitting in on some professor's class that you're not actually taking their module, but it is a kind of audit of my own uncertainties there. I didn't feel I should duck the future. I feel historians should have something to say about the future, if only because there is no key clean dividing line between past, present, and future. In many ways, as I say, the account is about the stability, actually, of Western states, and to argue that we shouldn't exaggerate terroristic threats. But at the same time, some of the barbarisms, really, that we see around us are genuinely novel, and they seem to proliferate. There seems to be a diffusion of targeting. If one thinks of a lot of classical terrorism, it's really about the main stage. It's about metropolitan city centers. It's about prestige airports. We seem to be seeing something through vehicle ramming, through this primitive turn that has become more diffuse and less predictable. And I think we can only understand it both through the imitative effects of social media, but also a sort of hybrid effect. I think the primitive turn towards tactics makes a lot more sense if we simply factor in the idea that streets these days are full of camera phones. And if you take a car and mow people down, you will generate dramatic footage, whereas 20, 30 years ago, by the time the press photographers turned up, there really wouldn't have been that much to dominate the front pages. So I think there is a kind of, in some ways, a kind of interesting hybridity. I mean, it's a little bit like empowering people. The point isn't always the high-tech experimentation, it's the people tinkering in their garden sheds and backyards and whatever. So there's a sort of interesting synergies between some primitive attack forms and the ease with which they can be communicated in wider and destabilizing ways. So I'm sure I've banged on for quite long enough, but in many ways, Killing Strangers, I think of as a sort of tour of what I arrogantly perhaps think of as kind of Locke's research doors. It's like walking through into a cellar. I take a load of flying kicks at a load of Locke's doors. Whether I go flying backwards and sprawl on my backside in the corridor, or whether the locks give way and some new spaces are opened up for debate, I'll leave for you in your good sense to decide. But I think I've said quite enough. I'll leave it there and greatly look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. There's so much there that I'd like to talk to you about. And I enjoyed reading the book. I had a lot of questions when I read it as well, but also some stimulating ideas that I'd just like to react to and have us talk about back and forth. But let me just first ask you about the concept of modernity, because that's where you started the book, and that is what the book is overall about, as you've explained to us. Would you say that you answered the essay question in ways that you could number? So from what I remember in the book, communications, the impersonal nature of violence is what makes it modern, the strength of the state. What am I leaving out, if anything?
Thank you. I'm not sure I ever numbered my thoughts. I think they're much more chaotic and impressionistic than that. One major theme that came to me relatively late, and with hindsight, I might have developed more and may develop more in future work, is thinking about the antonymic relationship between war and peace in Western modern societies as it's grown up over several hundred years. If one looks back at the Middle Ages, it's clear that contemporaries were sophisticated observers of a much more calibrated form of political violence around them. Feudal barons fighting each other. You could ignore if it was, down the road and wasn't going to affect you, and you could calculate that really quite sensitively. What seems to happen is that the military and civil society, so to speak, separate out. So the military retires behind barrack walls and specialized training, and civilian society becomes demilitarized. So, wearing swords in public and that sort of thing. The duel dies out by the sort of late 18th century in many Western European countries. And so sort of slowly war and peace become seen as antonymic, clearly defined categories in a kind of Tolstoyan way, which they hadn't been before. If you look at, say, early modern wars, they're fairly chaotic, and they tend to put such a burden on, say, I don't know, the Bourbon state or whatever in 17th century France, that it leads to hundreds of tax revolts. So, peace and war aren't very clearly delineated. It seems to me one of the things that it has originated in modern Western states over 300-400 years is that they have become fairly delineated. And I don't think we can really understand the sort of violence we think of as terroristic without factoring that in, because it's a kind of point that people keep coming back at me about, well, this impersonal violence that happened in, all kinds of things of medieval crusades. Yes, it did. It happened on the battlefield. But I think that separating out of an expectation, a civic expectation that, there isn't going to be random slaughter, is one of the keys to understanding the shock behind terroristic violence. And again, there's that classic provocative Alex Schmidt phrase about terroristic violence is the peacetime equivalent of battlefield wartime atrocities, I think he said. There's something in that, I think, to explore. I haven't formulated it quite as cleanly as I'd like to, but I have a hunch that might be a way to go.
That's really interesting, Tim. So, by the way, please call me Audrey, and I hope you don't mind if I call you Tim. We're informal in the United States.
No, don't work away.
Okay. So are you saying that maybe I'm drawing this too far, but would you say that terrorism is one side effect of the professionalization of the Western military?
I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I'll take that away. Thanks, Audrey. I'll marinate that one. I was struck, I think, by many of the assumptions in a lot of the literature that terrorism is so to speak, the pursuit of politics by the same means as war, but just in a more amateur level and capacity. And the more I thought about it, the less sure I was about that. I think the fact that dynamite is a product of the commercial world, not the battlefield, the fact that many of the shock tactics are structured essentially by PR values. I found the idea of the terrorist attack as a pseudo event being media theory communication term for events that only exist to be publicized, the ribbon cutting ceremony, this kind of stuff, the press conference. It suggested to me it did have deep roots actually in civilian society. And to that extent, yes, you could see it as a kind of unexpected long-term spin-off of professionalization of militaries.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Okay, well, let me ask you another question about this meaning of what it is to be modern. And by the way, I've already made a mistake because you don't talk about terrorism. You talk about a range of different kinds of political violence, which I want to sort of help understand in a minute. But before we leave this point of modernism, do you think that modern political violence, in order to be modern, also had to be global, outside of one country? At least in its effects.
I think your maps, that show the spread of attacks to India and so on. And I think there is some good work now coming out, isn't there, on the sort of, particularly on the kind of legal side of the genealogy of how this type of violence was seen by the Indian colonial state, which after all did have a seat at the League of Nations in 1934, amazingly. I think there is a global diffusion there, and to that extent, I think the sort of standard claims in the literature that we can't really understand the sort of 1880s moment without situating it against a globalized and globalizing world is absolutely right. So I suppose the point I'm making is, I think there is a kind of originally kind of Western way of violence that then diffuses, and it will change. I'm not trying to make a just one way argument. Part of my ducking that challenge of the feedback, if you like, from contexts like India, Russia, whatever, is simply manageability. I didn't think I could do a global history well, but I also thought there was something distinctive about these societies and this type of violence in origin, even if it then changes.
Very, very interesting. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog barking. I can't do anything about it. Okay, well, for the sake of our audience, and also to remind me, can you review again what the different kinds of violence from below that you covered as political violence? Because it was really interesting to me. You included banditry, you included a large number of different types of activity. So for the sake of the audience, would you mind just kind of reviewing some of those?
Sure. Okay, so part of my starting point was really, because I came to this as a historian, not a scholar of terrorism at first, I was struck by the richness of historiographical literatures on phenomenon like what Eric Hobsbawm called social banditry. So, social banditry is essentially bandits who exist and survive through some degree of popular support, so that it's kind of proto-political violence. They are, to use his phrase, primitive rebels. So I looked at social banditry, and to be honest, just as an aside, I mean, I think one of the best things on the history of terrorism that is almost never cited is a 10-page passage at the end of Eric Hobsbawm's Bandits in the 1981 edition, where he looks at the Symbionese Liberation Army in California in the 1970s, who did, after all, do kind of expropriations and with the Patty Hearst ransom, and say, you know, how are these like traditional bandits in a kind of more agrarian society? How they like, or indeed even a transitional society? You know, how similar are they to Jesse James or not? And there's a, you know, superb analysis of actually a lot of this is something different. There's a kind of different quality to it. So I looked at social banditry and why and how it dies out. I also looked at a broad range of what is sometimes called rough music or charivari, which are sort of violence tinged shaming ceremonies that you get across a lot of European societies, but also to some extent in the USA. And I think it's not a huge stretch of the imagination to see southern states lynching as belonging really to that wider tradition, albeit obviously a particularly brutal and idiosyncratic manifestation of it. And, you know, really looking at what is distinctive about those traditions, which are definitely fading from the late 19th century, broadly speaking, but they certainly surge back at moments when state authority is compromised, in occupation zones after World War I, in the kind of chaos across Europe in sort of 44, 45. They come back very, very quickly, all that punishing of supposed collaborators. And, you know, a lot of it is very, very unpleasant stuff and very patriarchal, as a sort of absolute obsession with, you know, policing women's sexual behavior and so on and so forth. But, you know, what is striking about all of those traditions is they come from an assumption that justice to some extent belongs still to the local community and is theirs to enforce. Justice in inverted commas, obviously. And, you know, that seems to be something that pretty relentlessly dies out. I mean, you do get strange echoes of it, actually. I mean, as late as the 1970s, northern Italian car factories, you know, quite a lot of the left-wing violence kind of draws on those kind of peasant traditions, but it's definitely in decline, and it seems to be an irreversible process. So, you know, all of this is proto-political violence. It's on the edge of political violence, but I didn't want to draw the boundaries too tight. As I say, I felt one might exclude a lot. There's also a lot on the history of rioting and you know, how once urban societies are quite good at it. It's admittedly a transitional stage, but the societies of early industrial Europe, of sort of, you know, Paris in 1830, 1848. There's a real kind of know-how, and there's a communal knowledge about how you build a barricade and how you organize it and so on and so forth. And you compare that to sort of overturning a few cars and torching them on TV these days. You know, I think there's something big has changed there. At the same time, you know, television does bring its own rewards, and, you know, I do have a brief discussion of what I call the bargain basement of rebel ordnance, which is, you know, the humble petrol bomb. I think the humble petrol bomb, when used systematically, is actually strangely effective and destabilizing. You know, used as a petrol bomb in Northern Ireland in 1969, turn a local crisis into a national one, and racist violence in Germany in 91, 92 does the same, petrol bombing asylum seekers, hostels, and so on. So, you know, rioting has definitely changed. I think become really less professional and less effective generally. But as I say, there is this counter dynamic of, if you can get enough attention, that can be genuinely destabilizing. The Capitol riot, 6th of January, a classic example. I mean, it's a kind of pretty crap amateur riot, really, if you pardon my language. But you know, I think we're all still living with the aftershocks, obviously.
Absolutely. I was actually going to ask you about that in a few minutes, but let me just mention that I thought it was extremely interesting the way you pulled together a lot of different kinds of violence, instead of doing what most of us who study terrorism, I speak for myself with some chagrin, but most of us separate out terrorism as being unique and distinct from the other types of violence. And it makes it very difficult to write books that incorporate the history and the kind of statistics. Part of the reasons why I think terrorism is separated out is that the databases support that. So if you're going to do anything quantitative at all, I mean, even just looking at correlations, you have to be able to look at violence that is described as terrorism as being different from banditry or rioting or heavens. Your section on lynching is really strong. I thought that was very important section, and to include that within the broader picture was a real gift, I think, to the reader and also to the field. So I appreciate that. I have not included all those other kinds of violence in my own work, but I think it's important, and I thank you for doing so. So let me ask you another question about the first part of your book, where you discuss you call them push factors, and the strength of the state and its bureaucratization, as you've explained to us, is one of the things that you see as leading to the development of terrorism against that bureaucratized state, I believe. So does that follow through when you get out of Europe and in the United States, when you get out of North America? So the way I look at it, you're saying that this strong state leads to an increase in terrorism, particularly from the late 19th century. And is it also true that weak states experience less terrorism as a result, or less of this kind of strong music, rough music, as you've called it, this broad types of violence? Or is it just that we don't have good ways of collecting information about the violence in weaker states, perhaps some of the states in the global South, where we see some terrorism, but not very much? So is there any way to draw that outside of North America with respect to the development of the nation state?
No, it's an excellent question, and something I wrestled with in the design of the book. Yes, I mean, I suppose I do start really from the sort of assumption, to borrow Trotsky's phrase, that terrorism is bureaucracy turned inside out, as he once said. Walter Lacour kind of dismisses that as one of his less brilliant formulations, but I actually thought it was quite thought-provoking. I mean, the rest of the world's a big place to kind of state the blindly obvious, and I think that's partly why I was kind of didn't want to do it badly. I think, I do think that the sort of degree of control in the kind of society of hyperorder is in the West is pretty remarkable for how early it's achieved. I mean, I'm struck by something Gary Lefree said in compiling the global terrorism database of just, the nightmare countries of the Iraqs and whatever. How do you tell? How do you conceptually pass out what is guerrilla warfare, terrorism, whatever? So, I do think it depends a bit on the period. My sense, and I think there's just a huge research agenda to advance here historically, is everything is in soft focus before 68. There's one thing about terrorism studies, it's the the quantification fashion of the kind of late 60s, early 70s has been really helpful, but it has had the contrast effect that everything before then is incredibly soft focus. My sense from some of the good work that's been done on, say, India, is that one can see a diffusion of terroristic style tactics, storming the assembly, and in the late 20s, done in various assassinations using dynamite, so on. But this is conscious borrowing. I mean, they are talking to Irish revolutionaries. We can chart some of those networks. At what speed it diffuses, at what speed it develops its own momentum, at what speed it develops its own syncretic traditions in different contexts, I'm much less sure, and that is part of my cowardice of not widening the aperture and killing strangers. I just think that takes. That's a major research project with a lot of different scholars who know about places I don't. I think is the honest answer, but that's my best impressionistic guess.
No, that makes perfect sense. Actually, when I was writing my book, I was really worried about those other parts of the world, because it's hard to get good information too. I mean, it's anyway. But I think you're right. It's hard to resist also bringing some of your conclusions forward and trying to apply them in other places. Let me just pause and encourage some of the people who are attending, who I know are very interested in this topic and qualified, and some of them are my students and grad students. Please go ahead and ask your questions in the Q&A box, because there are a lot of things that I would like to go on and talk to Tim about. But if you've got questions, I would encourage you to join the dialogue. Okay, so getting back to some of the points that you've made, particularly, I think it's in chapter 3 of the book, where, and you've referred to this already, where you're talking about political violence in Western states and how Western states became more or less immune to insurrection. And you've also referred obliquely to the January 6th riots. What do you think about, I know you don't like talking about the future, Tim, but how about the present? What do you think about the immunity now of Western states to that kind of rough music from below now, particularly, of course, in view of the January 6th insurrection, but you know, even more broadly?
Thanks. Well, yes. I mean, I did have a sort of a nervous period when, having made these probably unwisely confident claims, I sort of watched, as so many did, with trepidation, the trajectory of the American election and then the aftermath of the book. I mean, the unworthy part of me thought this is going to make Killing Strangers a short-lived book if I'm spectacularly wrong. But I mean, obviously on a more moral political level, it was, it did go very, very badly wrong. That was the fate of my book. It doesn't matter comparatively. I mean, it's certainly dramatic stuff, clearly, and the scenes are pretty, the images are, hard to wipe out when you've seen them. They're horrific, and I was surprised as anyone. I mean, it's clearly a major security problem. I mean, just on a kind of very mundane policing level, that should have been preventable. I mean, just should have been, as far as I can see. So from that point of view, I don't think the sort of intrinsic resources of the state, even in America, are fundamentally compromised. The general sort of level of polarization is clearly worrying, and how systematically that can be weaponized in a coherent way, I think is what I'm struggling to get my head around. I still am optimistic enough to think and hope that so long as basic state institutions remain relatively robust, so long as there isn't another government that just encourages freewheeling chaos for its own agendas, and there's no finger pointing here. The UK is not in a great shape right now. We may look back on this period as a nasty warning that did eventually settle down. I mean, I'm struck by the barriers still, as I see it, to convert very worrying disorder into insurrection. And I do have a very brief analysis, and it is a micro case study, admittedly, but I have a very sort of brief analysis of an incident in East Germany, in Chemnitz, the old Karl-Marx-Stadt, in late summer of 2018, I think it was, where they had a big festival to celebrate whatever it was, 750th, was it, anniversary of the town's foundation. And sadly, a German asylum carpenter got stabbed to death. He seemed to, so a German Cuban carpenter got stabbed to death. The murderers seemed to have been asylum seekers, and absolute bedlam broke loose. And at every single stage of that crisis, the state was one step behind. So the far right football hooligan scene had mobilized people in numbers the police couldn't cope with. There was basically almost pogromic scenes of chasing people who looked foreign in the streets. Horrible stuff. It was leaked that one of these guys at least should have been deported. Someone in the whatever part of the government leaked that. The politicians didn't seem to be able to get their kind of messaging together. So whether it was the political representatives or the bureaucracy, absolute disarray. I mean, you could see these destabilizing effects of social media mobilizations, and what I christened as a sort of sinkhole effect, in the same way as you don't maintain the road, and it's suddenly you get this kind of huge big crater. That the point is, it's been building up for a long time, but the revelation of it is very dramatic. It's a local crisis, but there's always many more places like it, so it has a destabilizing effect. And all of that was pretty terrifying, and claimed some pretty senior scalps, the head of the German secret services, basically. But when elements of that far right then tried to build on this, tried to build momentum, turned to planning a bombing campaign, they were rounded up very, very quickly. So I'm not, I am slightly jury out on that, and I have to kind of confess to my agnosticism, but I'm I'm not absolutely convinced the state is as weakened. I mean, certainly facing new threats, and politics is clearly in a very bad way across Western countries, the sort of public trust in our institutions. But in terms of capacity, I'm not sure yet the crisis is terminal, but that may be wishful thinking.
No, actually, I think at least judging by anecdotal information here in Washington, there was a big riot planned on the 18th, Saturday the 18th, this past Saturday, and it fizzled. So, and plus we've had a huge response on the part of the FBI. I think there are over 600 indictments. So I think your book is probably safe. All right, we have some questions coming in. The first one is from Asfai Ashraf. And he asked, did you look at past cases of state exploitation of terrorism? And if so, what were your findings? So state terrorism.
Hi, Afi. So, as I say, I mean, I was a bit of a coward of using the terrorism label. I mean, one of the sort of major points I was trying to make was really the asymmetry of the challenge. So it's a book that the first half of which kind of relentlessly keeps banging on about sort of state power. And as part of that, I talk in passing about the kind of sheer scale of destructive power that modern states command and the Holocaust and so on and so forth. It's not the main focus, but I tried not to ignore it because I think very often lip service is paid to how we need to look at terrorism and counterterrorism holistically, but actually it's very, very hard to do because they look very different often in terms of resources. So from that point of view, it's there. I did talk a fair bit about some of the unofficial state terroristic passages. I tried to build on a claim made by people like Eric Hobsbawm that, really the kind of the death squad is a phenomenon that we don't really see before the end of World War I. And there's various reasons for that. There's obviously the kind of crisis of state legitimacy and defeated powers that leads to a kind of security vacuum. But it's more than that too. I think it's a particularly historical juncture, and I make the sort of claim that one can't really imagine the death squad without the motor vehicles. Motor vehicles are absolutely central to abducting victims and then leaving them in prominent places. So, so from that point of view, it is predominantly a book about violence from below, if you like, and how it's evolved. But within that, I do try and keep the realities of potential for state coercion and center stage, and do look at some of the sort of auxiliary pro-state terror tactics and state-sponsored terrorism, actually. I mean, Dan Byman's wonderful book on state-sponsored terrorism is great. If I had a quibble, it's like, I'm not sure he says this explicitly in fairness, but there is a kind of working assumption often that we're talking about something that arises in the Middle East in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. And I think, if you look at the fascist regimes in the 30s, I write about that a bit. I mean, they're up to their necks in it. The so-called cagoulards, the hooded ones in Paris, Mussolini's bankrolling them, and the Ustache, and the Nazis are doing their own stuff too. So I think really that's the genesis of that kind of state-sponsored terror tradition. So that's it's not primarily a book about state terror and phenomenon like mass ethnic cleansing and genocide, but they're not totally ignored, and there is some space for more auxiliary tactics, kind of horrors the state sponsors there as well.
Okay, I interpreted your Afi's question wrong. Actually, but you got to the answer he wanted anyway. He wanted to talk about not just state tactics, but exploitation by states of terrorist groups, and that's state-sponsored terrorism, which you've already answered. So that's wonderful. Thanks, Tim. We have a question now from my colleague at American University, who's a professor and the co-director of the center. He asks, could you say more about violence as a way of establishing local control? You mentioned it briefly in your comments on rough music. This seems potentially important given increasing urban-rural tension. Sure.
I mean, this may not be quite what you have in mind, Joshua. I'm very happy. Please do follow on and push back if I'm sort of missing the point. I mean, in a sense, the book is about widening horizons. It's about globalization. It's about violence staged for big audiences globally. So to that extent, it's actually about the dissolution of local boundaries. And that's actually one of the things I talk about in the introduction is, we've got these classic literatures by historians, often of a left-wing bent of the sort of late 60s, 70s on banditry and rioting crowds and so on and so forth. And, I think what was notable about that kind of literature is it often did look at relatively local arenas. And what I was trying to chart was what happens when the world becomes more globalized or begins to, what then happens to violence as a result. That said, I do, there are some offcuts, and I don't know how other academics work, but I always have kind of, research projects that sit in drawers and haven't quite come to fruition. And I have long flirted with something comparatively on deeply divided societies of a sort of the Belfast, the Algiers, the Jerusalems, Nicosia, Beirut sort of type places. And there are some relatively dense and inaccessible footnotes of some sort of newspaper work I've done on that. In which really, I suppose that the point there is if a society is sharply divided enough, as those places all have been at various times, I'm sort of very struck by the phenomenon of violence as a small input, large output problem. It doesn't need much terror to really terrify everyone. If everyone is seen as a representative of one community or the other, and if this type of violence is representative, in other words, often with sectarian or ethnic violence, you are targeted not because you've done anything, because you represent a group. So if everyone's a representative, victims are chosen as representatives, then third point, everyone's potentially a victim. Fourth point, under those circumstances, it takes very few people to kill just enough people to scare everybody. And in those kind of societies, violence is it's not an index of the kind of level of virtue or morality of the inhabitants. It's a structural dynamic in which the militant extremes have a hold over the whole of society. And I think often political scientists, social scientists, we leave atmosphere to the poets and the journalists, don't we? But I'm struck by if we try and theorize atmosphere as the sort of climate of public expectations as to what's going to happen next, within which really all business or public business must be conducted, then it is very striking how similar the descriptions of, say, Belfast in 1922 and 1972 are. This kind of cyclical pattern when the sectarian violence is going on, often a drip, drip, drip effect of relatively small scale incidents. But in the words of one judge in Belfast in 1922, that part of the city was, as he puts it, vibrating with murder, which I wanted to use as a title for my first book, but I think OUP thought it would be sound like some awful kind of Buddhist kind of ripper or something like that. But that kind of sheer intensity of atmosphere, I think, is often what gets lost in analysis, actually. Stathis Calabas makes that point. Effective terror is often administered in small doses. So from that, I think that does feed into the control of certain local situations under certain specific circumstances that we, perhaps could work harder at theorizing.
Okay, so Josh, if you want to follow up, just put it in the Q&A. But I'd like to ask you again about the relationship between rough music, terrorism, other types of violence, and war. And in particular, do you think, it used to be that there was a relationship between assassination or, sometimes terrorist attacks and overreaction on the part of a state, which leads to interstate war. So you can call it a catalytic attack, or you can call it just, destabilizing a currently existing situation, which was what I think happened in the First World War in a very tactical, defined way with the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But anyhow, what do you think that there is more or less or no relationship between rough music and interstate war now?
Yeah, I suppose the premise of the question is that, and I imagine you're thinking of things like 6th of January riots, is they are kind of in the rough music tradition. I suppose my question back to you is, are they? Yes, there is a certain amount of kind of hanging effigies and gallows and very horrible imagery, but is it really the same thing? It certainly draws on some of the same tropes. I'm not sure it has the same local intensity. What I was struck by in my writing on, say, lynching, and you know, I felt very much an interloper there. I mean, that I'm sort of breaking into new literatures, but it very struck how it was a local drama. I mean, you know, these things were very often, you know, intensely local. Now they begin to change, and you know, by the sort of early 20th century, you have these bizarre and horrific phenomena of the sort of, you know, local excursion trains, and tens of, you know, sort of wait a day or two or a few hours, and, you know, tens of thousands of people turn up. But, you know, before then, it's kind of, you know, it really can be a very local neighborhood event. And I think it's impossible to understand its dynamics without understanding the sheer complexity of those relationships. I'm not sure what we're seeing now is in the rough music tradition, but, you know, by all means, you know, do push back. I mean, I think it's something new. I think it's, and I suppose to this extent, I am, you know, I'm quite affected by, or quite influenced by people like Manuel Castells, The Rise of the Network Society, this kind of sociology of the internet. And, you know, working that through myself, and I think I spent the first few years of the 20th century just denying that the internet was going to change all our lives, and I spent the rest of the time sort of trying to catch up, you know, because I used to say to my grad students, well, you know, you think the internet is changing everything, but, you know, if you need a babysitter in remote eastern Scotland in St Andrews, and the, you know, service in New Delhi is no good to you, kind of thing. But, you know, now I've got, yeah, okay, yeah, some very big things have changed. But I think it's I'm actually, you know, if one wants to look at past analogies, I'm more struck by not the social embeddedness in local contexts of a phenomenon like QAnon. I'm more struck by the similarity of the ideology to say a classic study like Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, first published in 1970, the kind of magical thinking in which, you know, all is not as it seems, and there are celestial beings who are manipulating everything. If you just kind of transpose, you know, Zionist occupation government or whatever conspiracy nonsense onto, you know, that kind of image of a deity or devils or whatever that are controlling everything, I mean, the thought patterns are really not that dissimilar. So I'm still working that one through. I think some of the ideas and the tropes and the prejudices and the assumptions are pretty old, actually, but I think that the actual social network dynamics and how it spreads, organizes, I'm inclined to think is more novel. But, you know, say, feel free to kind of push back. I'm still thinking that one through.
No, I don't have anything to push back. This isn't quite exactly the same thing because it's the other way around, but there are a lot of people very worried about the role of people who have served in the armed forces in the United States as being involved in some of the worst aspects of the January 6th riots. There's about 12% of the people who have been indicted who are veterans, and the overall percentage in our country is about 7%. That's the last time I looked at the numbers, so this may have updated, but, you know, it's a concern because the United States has been at war for so long, but that's not really what I asked you about, so it's a bit of a tangent. So we have a question from Harrison Brooks, who is one of our fellows in the center. And he asks, let's see, looking at the sheer destruction and chaos wrought by World War II, particularly in France and Germany, what mechanisms do you think enabled those states to reassert their authority so quickly and firmly in the post-war era?
Thanks, Harrison. No, an excellent question. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in Killing Strangers was kind of put the Second World War back in. You know, it's really obvious admission from, say, David Rappaport's Four Waves. You know, it's the biggest kind of event of political violence in history, and it's not really mentioned. So that crisis of state authority, and as you say wisely, the speed of reconstruction of it is one of the really striking features. I think my basic answer would be to say that already by that stage of the 1940s, I think statist assumptions are pretty embedded in local populations. And I write quite a lot about that, about actually how brief the window of the kind of rough music reprisals and so on are in France and Italy. Very struck by Claudio Pavoni's amazing book, A Civil War on the Italian Resistance. He, of course, was a veteran of it. And he has a quote from one of his comrades there that, you know, as outlaws, we tended to re-enter the law. I think one of the things that I do talk a little bit about the resistance groups in Western Europe is their kind of procedural obsessionalism, the extent to which they kind of were obsessed with some sort of attempt at due process and building a counter state. Even the machine gunning of Mussolini, which is kind of rushed and hurried at dawn, but he still gets some kind of sentence read out to him before he's shot, even under those circumstances. There's a kind of real obsession with looking like a state and acting like a state. And the real period of reprisals and chaos is surprisingly short-lived, despite the material destruction. So I think it is really about the socialization of entire populations by that period that has gone pretty deep. There's another good quote, I think, from one of Pavoni's comrades about, well, we've got to shoot these fascists now, now being sort of May 1945, because in war you shoot and in peace you don't. So we've got a kind of window of opportunity to finish them off. And that, again, that sort of antonymic assumption that war is war and peace is peace. And, actually we've got to kind of, it's right and proper and really ineluctable that those boundaries are kept clean. I think is one of the kind of most striking features of the sheer chaos of Europe in 45 is how quickly it is put together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, co-director Josh Rovner has come back. He wants to follow up, and it's an interesting comment. He says that what you said was very helpful. What he was getting at was the sense that local control, rural communities are getting more antagonistic with respect to centralized control. So I think this is particularly true in the United States. But anyway, town hall meetings are becoming belligerent. Crowds are heckling speakers at COVID-19 events, school board members at meetings on teaching history and race relations. I think he's saying are being attacked and so on. So I wonder if this trend foreshadows something more violent and unsettling. Interesting. Any thoughts?
Well, only half-baked ones, I'm afraid, and I'm, very much a Europeanist who's strayed into holding forth on North America in ways that I'm sure are facile and underdeveloped. I mean, I think. Thank you for the clarification. I mean, I'm sort of struck in a module I teach. There's a kind of CSTPV tradition going back to Paul Wilkinson, actually, on terrorism and liberal democracy, in which I sometimes have to persuade the students it's worth looking at, but I hit them with kind of Hofstadter's classic essay, Reflections of American Violence, which is, whatever it's the date on it, 1st of January 1970. And it's a very striking piece of writing, of course, in which he sort of essentially argues for a tradition of American confidence. You can, from a European point of view, tolerate really quite high levels of ghetto violence or interpersonal violence in certain places, because it's not system threatening, because this sort of genuine insurrectionist tradition is underdeveloped in American politics compared to, say, France or a lot of European countries. The country's huge, the neighbors are basically unthreatening. Mexico and Canada are not likely to invade anytime soon, and the oceans are huge on either side. So, you can be fairly, historically, back in 1970, you can have a lot of turmoil, but it's not system threatening, was his analysis. And it does look a bit like a period piece 50 years on, especially after the 6th of January. So I think there's something going on there, would be my hunch. And, I absolutely defer to those of you who will tell me I don't know my American politics, and that's fine. The question is, can it be mobilized, weaponized? I mean, Trump was a sort of grand old Duke of York type leader, wasn't he? I mean, he wasn't exactly kind of decisive Führer politics, thank God. But maybe he'll have a second go. I mean, what would a violent mobilization look like? How would that turn into insurrection? I'm not saying it couldn't. I think there's clearly something going on that is more than just a few isolated pockets. But how it would be weaponized or become genuinely a violent challenge to the system, I'm much less sure about, and would be very interested to hear your views.
I'm sorry that you're not on the call, Josh. We'd love to hear from you. Actually, I would only throw in another thing that is unusual about the United States versus countries in Europe, which is the militia movement and the right to bear arms, which means that we have more firearms in the United States per capita than any other country in the world by a factor of, I've forgotten, perhaps it's 5 or 10. So it's a little easier to mobilize and weaponize, mobilize through current media, and then weaponize, they already are. So, but don't you think there's anything parallel at all when it comes to the UK? I'm genuinely wondering, do you get any of that kind of pushback at a local level against centralized authority that becomes aggressive or even violent?
I mean, of course, yeah, the militia tradition is a vital difference. Although I'm kind of struck by how much American disorder doesn't use guns. I mean, there's a fascinating study to be done of Seattle, I mean, there's a lot of guns being brandished, but relatively rarely used, thank God. And I'm not saying that these things can't change, but that, there's definitely a study of restraint, and I'm sure it is being done by people. In terms of the UK, I mean, to be absolutely honest, Audrey, I mean, there's a reason that despite my posh English accent and Cambridge upbringing, I became an Irish historian, or a historian of Ireland, I should say, because English history, particularly England said advisedly, English history is so soporifically dull. They just never get around to having a revolution. They never come close. I mean, they last had a kind of decent civil war worth the name in 1651. There's a reason why, our last good theorist of civil wars is Hobbes. Okay, Hobbes is great and still up there, but it's an extraordinarily ironic tradition by any comparative lens if you pan out. So it's hard to get things started, especially in England. And I think even if you look at being at St Andrews, of course, the Scottish independence debate, Ireland's very, very different. And I think, it's a banal point, but I think path dependency matters here. And the barriers to getting a violent insurrectionist tradition started when there's not much of a tradition of it is pretty high psychologically. I mean, a good colleague of mine, Nick Brooke at St Andrews, has written a study of really asking a very simple question of kind of why was there no Scottish or Welsh nationalist equivalent of the IRA, because there were those groups and there have been more attempts than one might think. But, apart from some blowing up some pylons, electricity pylons in the 1950s and things, it's very hard to get that going, and it's kind of been just forgotten, thank goodness. So, yeah, I mean, frankly, the English are pretty dull and pretty that kind of stuff. Which, I mean, is in many ways a huge blessing, of course.
But that's fascinating, though, because the Scottish have such a tradition of being strong soldiers, a martial tradition. So it's a very interesting question. I'd like to read that work when it's available.
No, it's fascinating stuff. Well, I think it's the thing about the British state, isn't it? Is there's these pockets of expertise on how you do counterinsurgency that come from an empire and come from Northern Ireland, but they are just that, pockets. Mm-hmm. And the wider society is takes a degree of order really for granted. I mean, the best description or pointer I can give that is the last half page of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, where he describes getting the boat train he's come over from Paris, he's exhausted, he's disillusioned, and it's just half a page and he describes southern England getting the boat train up from the south coast to London and just how sleek and prosperous the landscape is. And you just think, yeah, there's been no violent disorder here for hundreds of years, and that, yeah, I mean, that obviously in many ways that's a great thing, but it doesn't always mean that I think we're the best at understanding places where they do live with the threat of violence. And I say that in all humility.
Well, good point. Not sure it's true, but because you do seem to understand it. But anyway, thank you. I would like to do something that I warned you about. Josh comes back. He says it's very helpful. What I'm getting at is a sense that rural communities are increasingly antagonistic. Oh, whoops. I think we've already. All right. I think that's the other comment. So let's move forward. I was hoping, as an example to my fellow students and also fellow Americans, that you would read the last paragraph of your book, because one of the things that I love about the book is how well written it is. And this is a skill that I think is underappreciated. At least I put a lot of emphasis upon it, as my students know, and as our fellows and everybody else associated with the center knows. So would you mind just reading the final paragraph so that we can enjoy it?
How could I refuse it? Thank you, Audrey. That's extraordinarily kind. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you warned me, so I do have it to hand. By the early 21st century, in contrast, danger had democratized. Attacks can now be against anyone and for any cause. Resentments, myths, and pseudo-grievances bubble away merrily online. And within the giant magic lantern show of social media, the shadows continue to grow longer and larger. Seen from this longer-term vantage point, the dark progress of Western political violence has taken the form of a relentless and irresistible diffusion. From assassination to massacre, from hazard of social rank to rank social hazard, from the classes to the masses, from feud to fad, an ever widening Gaia.
Brilliant. I love that closing chapter, closing paragraph and chapter. So is there anything that you'd like to add, Tim, that we haven't covered effectively? I think it's an absolutely wonderful book. And again, let me show everyone the front cover. And our conversation is going to be, is recorded, and it will be available on our website. So there will be additional people listening and probably sending you emails after we've finished. Those of you in the audience who want to pursue any of these matters, you can get the contact information, if that's all right with you, Tim. We'll share your email address with anyone among our fellows and among our audience who would like to contact you and pursue some of these questions further. But is there anything else that you would like to add?
Merely to echo what you've just said, I'm always on for continuing the dialogue and discussion, and I, never mind. Indeed, I welcome being approached by email from. So, if you do wish to continue that dialogue by email or whatever format, please do not hesitate to get in touch. No, I would just thank you for the platform and for the chance to discuss Killing Strangers. It's a book that was long marinated, long thought about, then written in a tearing hurry as research leave ran down. But it tries to do a lot. It tries really to open up a whole range of areas for debate. We haven't talked much about sabotage, which the last chapter is about. But I do try and take in a lot. It, in many ways, is an impressionistic book. I'm sure that there are kind of flanks for reviewers to attack or to dig deeper in, and if it invites others to consider more deeply and penetrating the areas that I've only superficially and sketchily treated, then I will be more than content. But for this discussion for today, it's just been a pleasure to talk about it, and thank you, Audrey. Deeply appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I've greatly enjoyed it. Do you want to say a word or two on sabotage? I see that we have a couple of minutes. I've missed time for the closing, but a word or two, because I think that's a fascinating part of the book, and it's my oversight not to have mentioned it.
No, I just kind of was struck how little we talk about sabotage these days. When we used to talk about it, I think quite a lot. And really, I sort of present sabotage as what I call inverse Fordism. So, Henry Ford, famously kind of reconstructed industrial production processes to be far more efficient through his kind of, compartmentalization of labor duties and as a kind of force multiplier. And I sort of try and present sabotage as really the kind of same process in reverse. It's a sort of attempt to take tightly coupled systems and multiply mayhem and disruption as best you can. And hence, again, like much of the book, I sort of make the argument that it isn't actually age old. I mean, often one has this claim terrorism is age old, sabotage is age old. Well, yeah, fine. There are techniques like arson that are destructive and very old, but this kind of calibrated mayhem seems to me to be something that depends and relies and is derived from the modern industrial society. I suppose the more speculative point, and one in which I'm sure your informed audience and members would know more about in the kind of cyber front is are we seeing a breakpoint? Is the rise of the kind of Internet of Things and the kind of cyber realm, does it lead to a different type of sabotage, or do the same patterns essentially carry over? Because really the central claim in the discussion of sabotage is actually harder to do than you think. There's a lot of redundancy in modern industrial societies, and that very often complex, certainly rich societies, they kind of soak up this disruption relatively easily, actually, and it's really states and state-sponsored saboteurs, French resistance or whatever it is, bankrolled by the British, trained by the OSS and the British or whatever in World War II that can do this kind of stuff best. Is that the same in the cyber realm? Is it really the kind of state actors we should be most worried about? My hunch is it may well be, but I'm a child of the 70s and not very tech savvy, so others may tell me that I'm wrong.
You're too modest. Your book is so interesting on so many broad themes. It's not just a history that has a lot of fascinating facts and brings to mind a lot of things that I'd forgotten about, in all honesty. But also it talks about the relationship between the state and violence, technology, the evolution of technology. Your chapter 5 is absolutely fabulous. I love it. In fact, I've got a million. If you look at the side of my book, you see all the little red tabs. That's the important points that you've made that I've flagged. Those of us in our center who are studying cyber, you should have a look at this book, because it's not just a history of the evolution of violence and sabotage, as Tim has just reminded us, but also there are a lot of things there that are thought-provoking for how we deal with violence today, and the use of these new means of communication, even when they're not physically violent. How do they engage in sabotage and disinformation and misinformation? Huge foundation in this book for thinking about those questions too. So with that, I will thank you so much, Professor Tim Wilson. It's been a great honor to have you as part of our CSINT Conversations, and also to have you talk about this wonderful book. And again, I urge those of you in the audience to read it, even better, buy it. But it's
your words, not mine.
Yeah, well, we're not in this business to sell books. You know, academics, that's not what it's all about. I think that you'll really gain a tremendous amount by reading it. And I'd like all of us to thank Professor Wilson. And if we were together, we would all be clapping at this point. But I will give you my personal applause. And thank you so very much. And I wish you all the best, Tim.
Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for the discussion. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers now.